There was a brass paperweight on the edge of the mahogany desk in room 304, a heavy, polished hexagonal cube that had no purpose other than keeping a stack of archival ledger pages from drifting in the draft of an old radiator. Every afternoon at 20 minutes past 4, the sun would cut through the tall, narrow window behind the desk and strike the corner of that paperweight, casting a small, perfectly sharp triangle of light across the second drawer. For 4 years, I watched that light move. I measured my days by it, by the faint smell of cedar shavings and dry paper, and by the sound of footsteps stopping just short of my door. He never came inside without knocking twice, not a sharp demand, but 2 light, measured taps that felt less like an assertion of authority and more like an asking of permission. And in all 4 years we worked in that building, under the same roof, sharing late hours and quiet corridors, he never once called me by my first name when anyone else was standing in the room. My name is Moira Prescott. I was 26 years old when I took the position of junior records custodian at the Sterling Maritime Archive in downtown Philadelphia, a quiet, low-profile institution housed in a gray stone building that smelled of damp limestone and old ink. It was not the kind of job people spoke about with pride at holiday gatherings. It carried no prestigious title, paid a modest salary that barely covered my rent on a third-floor walk up in South Philly, and offered no obvious ladder to climb. My family called it my temporary arrangement, a polite euphemism they used to soften what they saw as a complete lack of ambition. To them, I was the daughter who filed yellowing manifests, while my elder brother built a commercial real estate firm and my sister married into a family with a summer home in Maine. I should start with how it began, because the order matters, and because if you look at the end without seeing the slow, deliberate accumulation of quiet days, you might mistake what happened for something simple. I met Alistair Thorne, no relation, though the shared administrative circle was a source of minor organizational confusion during my first week, on a Tuesday in early November. He was the chief managing trustee of the archive, a man in his late fortnight of 50s who moved through the building with a deliberate, unhurried stillness. He wore tailored wool suits that were immaculate but entirely devoid of fashion, always in muted shades of charcoal or navy. His hair was silver at the temples, combed back neatly, and his eyes had a pale, observational quality that made you feel as though he were reading a document behind your forehead. The gap between us was absolute. He was a trustee from a prominent family whose grandfather had endowed the archive in 1920. I was an hourly clerk, hired to catalog water-damaged freight manifests from the mid-19th century. The rules of our interaction were clear, dictated both by corporate hierarchy and by the unspoken social code of the institution. Yet, within 3 months of my arrival, a routine established itself, one so subtle that I doubt anyone else in the building ever consciously logged it. Every morning at 8:15, before the main office opened and before the rest of the staff arrived, Alistair would walk down the long, carpeted hallway of the 3rd floor to drop off the morning intake folder on my desk. It was a task that any intern could have performed, yet he did it himself. He would knock twice, step inside just far enough to lay the leather folder on the corner of my desk, and state the date and the priority items in 3 sentences or less. "Good morning, Miss Prescott. The harbor records from 1880 need cross-referencing with the ledger in Cabinet B. There is no rush on the bill of lading. Thank you, Mr. Thorne," I would reply, looking up from my typewriter or ledger. He would linger for perhaps 3 seconds, his hand resting briefly on the edge of the desk, his eyes resting on whatever document I was working on, before giving a small, singular nod and stepping back into the hall. That was all, but over months, those 3 seconds became the anchor of my day. I began to notice things, The subtle scent of sandalwood and cold air that followed him into the room, the slight pause he made before speaking as if weighing every word, and the way his knuckles were slightly calloused, a detail that seemed incongruous with a man who dealt in books and endowments. There were motifs in our quiet dynamic, small, silent anchors that held the space between us. The first was a fountain pen, a vintage Parker Duofold in dark blue lacquer that he carried in his breast pocket. Whenever he signed a manifest I had prepared, he would unscrew the cap with a slow, deliberate twist of his thumb and forefinger. The second was the brass paperweight on my desk, which he had placed there himself during my second week, remarking simply, "The drafts in this wing are heavy in November. This will keep things where they belong." The third was a phrase he used whenever I caught a discrepancy in the records, a rare, quiet compliment delivered without warmth, but with absolute weight. "You have an exacting eye." Moira, it was the only time he used my first name, reserved exclusively for moments when I had solved a minor historical mystery hidden in the pages. By the second year, the unspoken tension between us had grown into a palpable structure, a room without walls that we both inhabited but never acknowledged. It was constructed entirely of restraint. It lived in the moments when our fingers brushed as I handed him a requested file, both of us instantly withdrawing our hands with a quiet, formal apology. It lived in the late afternoons when the rest of the staff had gone home and the building grew dark and still. He would remain in his corner office at the end of the hall, his door open just an inch, a sliver of warm light spilling across the parquet floor. I would remain at my desk, cataloging, both of us aware of the other's presence through the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the lobby and the occasional turn of a page. Never once did he invite me to step across that line. Never once did he suggest a drink after hours or make a comment that could be construed as personal. But the care was there, buried so deep under professional decorum that it felt like an underground river. Once, during a severe winter storm that shut down the city's transit system, I found a brass key on my desk with a note in his precise, copperplate handwriting. "The guest room on the executive floor is unlocked and heated. Do not risk the walk home in this weather." He was gone before I could thank him, his own coat missing from the rack. I stayed in the room, a pristine, quiet space with a framed maritime map and a single armchair, and found a thermos of hot tea and a folded blanket left on the nightstand. Nothing more. No appearance, no follow-up the next day. Just the silent provision of safety. People around us began to notice the quiet frequency of our interactions, even if they couldn't name what it was. Evelyn, a senior cataloger who worked on the second floor and had been with the archive for 15 years, stopped by my desk one Thursday afternoon while Alistair was in a board meeting. She leaned against the filing cabinet, watching me meticulously index a stack of fragile receipts. "He doesn't usually take such a personal interest in the junior inventory," Evelyn remarked, her voice casual but her eyes sharp. "In 10 years, I've seen Mr. Thorne hand off administrative intakes to 3 different department heads. I've never seen him walk a folder down to the 3rd floor himself every single morning." I kept my eyes fixed on the ledger, my pen steady. "He's very particular about the 19th century manifests. He mentioned early on that the classification system needed consistency." "Consistency," Evelyn repeated, a faint, knowing smile touching her lips. "Yes, I suppose that's one word for it. Just be careful, Moira. Alistair Thorne is a man built out of obligations. He doesn't break rules, he lives inside them." She didn't say it maliciously, she said it as a gentle warning, a reminder of the invisible fence that enclosed both of us. And she was right. The obstacle between us was not an angry spouse or a sudden professional rivalry, it was something far more formidable, and permanent, his own unshakable sense of duty, and the absolute disparity of our worlds. Alistair was married to the institution and to a legacy that required total propriety. He had a sister with severe health needs whom he quietly supported, a family name tied to the city's old philanthropy, and a reputation for absolute integrity that was his only real currency. For him to show favor to a young woman in his employ, or to allow even a shadow of impropriety to touch his name or mine, would have dismantled the quiet honor by which he lived. And for me, I was too proud to ever be a subject of gossip or a compromise in his structured life. The obstacle was tested once, explicitly, during my 3rd year at the archive. It was a Friday evening in late October, and a sudden pipe burst in the basement threatened a collection of early regional maps. Alistair and I spent 4 hours moving heavy wooden flat boxes up 3 flights of stairs to the dry safety of room 304. By 9 o'clock, we were exhausted, covered in faint dust and sweat, standing side by side in the narrow aisle between the metal shelving units. The air in the room was warm, thick with the scent of aged paper and wet slate. I reached up to place a heavy leather-bound ledger onto the top shelf, but my shoulder gave out from fatigue, and the volume slipped. Alistair stepped in behind me instantly, his arms coming up on either side of me to catch the weight of the book and secure it on the rack. For a span of 5 seconds, we were entirely motionless. His chest was inches from my back. I could feel the heat radiating through his wool waistcoat, could hear the quiet, rapid cadence of his breath near my ear. His hand rested on the edge of the shelf right next to mine, so close I could feel the pulse in his wrist. It would have taken nothing, a turn of my head, a shift of an inch, to collapse the distance between us. The silence in the room felt heavy, dense with everything that had gone unsaid for 3 years. I felt him stiffen slightly, his breath catching. Then, with a slow, deliberate exhalation, he lowered his arms, stepped back exactly 2 paces, and smoothed the front of his jacket. "That was the last of the dry boxes," he said, his voice lower than usual, rough around the edges, but completely controlled. "You should go home, Miss Prescott. The night is late." "Yes, Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I grabbed my coat and left. Neither of us mentioned that evening again. We chose the boundary. We chose it because crossing it meant destroying the very thing that made the space between us sacred, the absolute purity of an uncompromised devotion. Time passed, as it always does, sweeping through lives with quiet indifference. By my 4th year, my family's subtle disdain for my employment had hardened into a routine narrative. To them, my job was an embarrassment, an indicator that I had plateaued while everyone else moved forward. My brother had bought a home in the suburbs. My sister was planning an elaborate anniversary trip to Europe. I was still coming home every evening to a small apartment with ink-stained fingers and a modest paycheck. Then came the dinner. It was a Sunday evening in mid-November, held at my parents' house in Chestnut Hill. The dining table was set with heavy silver and white linen. My brother was holding court, describing a new commercial acquisition, while my brother-in-law discussed investment yields. I sat near the foot of the table, listening quietly, passing dishes when asked. "Moira," my mother said, pouring water into a crystal goblet, "have you given any more thought to that administrative opening at your brother's firm? It's an actual corporate track. It seems silly to keep spending your days sorting dusty paper for pennies." "I like the work at the archive, Mother," I replied gently. "It's quiet, and it matters to the city's history." My brother laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that cut across the table. "History doesn't pay rent, Moira. Let's be honest about what that job is. It's a glorified clerkship. You're an assistant to old men who don't even know your name." You've been sitting in that dark room for 4 years doing work an automated scanner could do in a week. It's a dead end. It's not a dead end, I said, my voice quiet, though my hands tightened in my lap under the napkin. It is, my sister chimed in softly, with that patronizing sympathy that hurts far more than anger. You're 29, Moira. You have no stock options, no real title, and no room for growth. You're spending the best years of your life sitting in a basement playing archivist for a foundation that wouldn't notice if you disappeared tomorrow. The dinner continued, the conversation shifting away from me, but the words hung in the air like heavy smoke. An assistant to old men who don't even know your name. A foundation that wouldn't notice if you disappeared tomorrow. I didn't defend myself further. I ate my meal, spoke when spoken to, and drove home to my cold apartment in silence. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, looking at my hands, feeling the crushing weight of their assessment. Was I hiding? Was this quiet devotion I felt for my work, and for the man who moved silently through its halls, just a self-imposed prison? The next morning, everything changed. I arrived at the archive at 8 o'clock, the air outside crisp and biting. The building was unusually quiet. When I reached the third floor, I noticed that the door to room 304 was standing wide open and the light inside was bright. Standing inside my small office were three people: Mr. Sterling, the senior chairman of the Board of Trustees, a legal representative from the city's Historic Preservation Trust, and Alistair Thorne. Alistair was standing near the window, his hands folded behind his back, looking out at the courtyard below. He wore his usual charcoal suit, immaculate and silent. When I stepped into the room, Mr. Sterling turned, holding a thick leather-bound portfolio bound in brass hardware. "Ah, Miss Prescott," Mr. Sterling said, his tone formal but respectful. "We were waiting for you. Please, step in." I looked from Mr. Sterling to Alistair. Alistair turned his head slowly, meeting my eyes for a brief, unreadable second before looking back down at the folder on my desk. He did not say a word. "Miss Prescott," Mr. Sterling continued, opening the portfolio. "As you may know, the board has been working over the past 18 months on the complete restructuring of the Archives endowment and the creation of the new Regional Historical Research Center. Under the terms of the new charter, a permanent Director of Historical Collections position has been created. An endowed chair with full curatorial authority, a substantial research budget, and a tenured seat on the Board of Trustees. I stood frozen near the doorway. I was not aware of the restructuring. "No, Mr. Sterling smiled thinly. "It was kept confidential until the endowment details were finalized. But more importantly, we are here today to finalize the appointment. When this chair was created, the board initially sought an external candidate from the university system. However, a comprehensive audit of the archive's internal operations and historical cataloging was submitted to us 8 months ago. Mr. Sterling pulled a thick, impeccably bound document from his briefcase and laid it on my desk. I recognized the binding immediately: dark blue leather, stitched by hand, signed at the bottom in precise copperplate ink. "This report," Miss Sterling said, "documents 4 years of meticulous recataloguing, structural reorganization, and historical recovery carried out in this wing. It demonstrates that the survival of our 19th century collection and the identification of over $2 million in forgotten land-grant titles now powering our endowment was entirely due to the work done right here in this room." Mr. Sterling looked directly at me. The report was authored by Mr. Thorne. In it, he declines the administrative directorship for himself and makes a single, non-negotiable condition for the release of his family's trust funds to the archive: that you, Moira Prescott, be named the inaugural Director of Collections, with full autonomy and an annual budget matching senior university chairs. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. I looked at the dark blue document on the desk, then slowly turned my eyes to Alistair. He remained standing by the window, his silhouette dark against the pale morning light. His expression was completely composed, but his hands were tightly clasped behind his coat. Furthermore, Mr. Sterling added, passing a second sheet of paper to me, the endowment includes the permanent naming rights of the research wing. Mr. Thorne requested that it be named the Prescott Collection, not after his grandfather, as was previously assumed, but explicitly dedicated to your work over the past 4 years. The room seemed to spin slightly. My family's words from 12 hours prior echoed in my ears, a glorified clerkship. An assistant to old men who don't even know your name. A foundation that wouldn't notice if you disappeared tomorrow. I don't know what to say, I managed to whisper, my hands shaking as I held the paper. You don't have to say anything today, Miss Prescott, Mr. Sterling said smoothly. The documents are prepared. You may review them with your counsel. Mr. Thorne, is there anything you wish to add? Alistair took a slow step forward. He did not look at Mr. Sterling, he looked directly at me. The pale light from the window caught the side of his face, illuminating the faint lines around his eyes. Only that the work was already done, Miss Prescott, Alistair said, his voice quiet, calm, and utterly steady. I merely put it on paper so that others would be forced to see what was always right in front of them. He unscrewed the cap of his navy Parker Duofold pen with that familiar, deliberate twist of his fingers, laid the pen neatly on top of the document on my desk, and gave a small, singular nod. I will leave you to review the terms, he said softly. Then he turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the quiet corridor until they faded completely. In the weeks that followed, the reckoning of those 4 years settled over me with the slow, irreversible weight of truth. I didn't leave the archive, I stepped into the new role, moving my work from the small room 304 into the large, high-ceilinged office at the end of the wing. My salary tripled, my name was listed at the top of the institution's letterhead. My family, suddenly stunned into quiet deference, invited me to dinners where they spoke in hushed, respectful tones about my extraordinary professional rise. But none of that mattered to me. What mattered was the recalibration of every memory I possessed. Every morning at 8:15 that he had walked down the hall, it hadn't been administrative routine. It had been the quiet, meticulous gathering of evidence to build my future. Every late afternoon we had spent in silence on opposite ends of the floor. He hadn't been ignoring me. He had been protecting my standing while working behind closed doors to guarantee my independence. The brass paperweight on my desk, the key left during the storm, the hands that caught the ledger on the high shelf and then immediately retreated. They were not moments of mere restraint or professional courtesy. They were the actions of a man who had loved me with a fierce, absolute, and completely unselfish devotion, choosing to elevate my life entirely at the expense of ever claiming a place in it. He resigned from the Board of Trustees 2 months after the endowment was finalized, citing his desire to retire to his family's property in northern Pennsylvania. He did not hold a farewell party. He did not make a speech. On his final afternoon in the building, I stood at the window of my new office. Watching the snow fall softly onto the courtyard below, there was a knock at my door, 2 light, measured taps. "Come in," I said, my heart pounding against my ribs. Alistair stepped inside. He wore a heavy dark overcoat and held his leather gloves in his left hand. He did not step far into the room, he remained near the door, respecting the boundary to the very end. "I am leaving for the station, Moira," he said quietly. It was only the second time he had spoken my first name aloud. I stepped out from behind the mahogany desk. I wanted to say 100 things. I wanted to ask him why he had hidden it for so long, why he had never given me the chance to tell him what those 4 years had meant to me, why he was choosing to walk away into the cold gray afternoon without asking for a single word of gratitude or affection. Instead, I stood facing him, separated by 10 feet of hardwood floor and 4 years of unspoken devotion. "You gave me my life, Alistair," I said, my voice trembling despite my effort to keep it steady. "You rebuilt everything for me, and you gave me no way to return it." Alistair looked at me for a long moment. His pale eyes were soft, devoid of the cold professional distance he had maintained for so long. A faint, sad smile touched the corner of his mouth, a look of such deep, quiet warmth that it took my breath away. "It was never something to be returned, Moira," he said softly. "Some things are built to stand on their own. I only wanted to make sure you were safe, and that the world saw you clearly." He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the vintage navy Parker Duofold pen, and set it gently on the small side table near the door. "Keep the paperweight," he added, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The drafts in this building are heavy in winter." He looked at me for one last second, a look held slightly too long, carrying the weight of 1,000 unwritten pages and a lifetime of restrained love, then gave a small, deliberate nod. "Goodbye, Moira. Goodbye, Alistair." He turned and walked out, the door closing softly behind him with a quiet click. I walked to the window and watched him cross the snow-covered courtyard, his long coat dark against the white ground, his gait unhurried and steady, until he passed through the iron gates and disappeared into the city. We never saw each other again. We never wrote letters, and we never spoke on the phone. The boundary remained unbroken, preserved in its absolute purity until the end. Now, years later, I sit in this large office at the end of the hall. The brass paperweight still rests on the edge of the mahogany desk, keeping the ledger pages from drifting in the draft. Every afternoon at 20 minutes past 4, the sun cuts through the tall window and strikes the corner of that hexagonal metal, casting a small, perfectly sharp triangle of light across the drawer. I pick up the dark blue Parker Duofold pen, unscrew the cap with a slow twist of my fingers, and begin my work. I learned then what I know now, that the deepest form of love is not always the one that demands to be possessed or spoken aloud in loud declarations. Sometimes, love is simply the quiet, unyielding choice to protect someone from the shadows, to build a fortress around their worth, and to step away into the cold morning light so that they can finally shine on their own. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.